Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Good to see you guys. Happy Sunday, first of all. I'm continuing the little journey of Enneagram and INFJs. I'm going to be discussing the type 1 today. Type 1, which is an Ennea type that is famously associated with INFJs. Not only with INFJs, but often with INFJs. And an argument that I've been making in the recent somewhat Enneagram focused series of videos is that in the same way that there's more Enneagram 5s among INFJs than we think, certainly more Enneagram 6s than we think, there are fewer 2s and probably fewer 1s as well. Okay, so I need to make an argument. I need to argue for this. I need to present a case. Otherwise, why would you believe me? And it's interesting to look at Enneagram 1 particularly because as compared with other Ennea types, the Enneagram 1 tends to benefit, as far as INFJs are concerned, the Enneagram 1 tends to benefit from particular kind of marketing, a particular kind of advertising, which might lead you to think that it is in fact the INFJ type. And I don't think that's the case. It took me years to realize that it wasn't the case. And I want to kind of probe you, see what you think. And if you think it's the case, maybe hopefully lead you, if not to change your mind, at least to open yourself up to a possible alternative perspective. All right, so before I move on, well, many of you might be aware of the fact that I have a new book out, right? So there's a book that I wrote in the past called The Ecstatic Soul. You're familiar with this one. It looks at the INFJ psyche, INFJ consciousness from an existential point of view. So this book, if you haven't read it yet, you want to understand the INFJ, read this book. The new book is called The Infinite Soul, and the first link down there in the description box is a link to The Infinite Soul. You have it in paperback, in ebook. It's less than $10. It's a great product. Early next week, possibly from tomorrow onwards, I'll be able to show it to you in my hands. I'll make a video to present it to you. Hopefully, I'll be able to do that maybe, early next week as well. But The Infinite Soul is kind of a book that, it's not kind of, it certainly is a book that takes the INFJ consciousness that has been explored in The Ecstatic Soul, then we make it infinite by looking at INFJs in the modern world. Once we know that we're the kinds of being that have this kind of psyche, this kind of soul, this kind of embodiment, or struggling with embodiment, then how do we go about having a happy, fulfilling, rich, emotional, meaningful life? That's what The Infinite Soul looks at. Links are below. Check it out, get a copy if you haven't yet. There's The Infinite Soul, there's The Ecstatic Soul, and there is The Infinite Castle, which is my novel. It's not on INFJs, but the rumor has it the main character is an INFJ. It's existential, it's magical realism, it's Kafka, it's Murakami, it's Dostoevsky. Get a copy if you haven't yet. Okay, so in terms of this Enneagram 1 business, so first of all, I said, if you notice at the start of this video, what I said was Enneagram 1 benefits from a particular kind of marketing, a particular kind of advertising in our lives. Particularly the INFJ 1, right? Not the Enneagram 1 as such, but the INFJ 1 especially. Which means that this is likely to twist and distort our perspective on how common 1 is for INFJs. And possibly how common 1 is in general, or for what kinds of people 1 is common. So what do I mean by this? I mean by this that the more shows I watch, that applies to novels as well, that applies to various different kind of supports for fictional works. But if we start from the reasonable premise that that the popular culture and popular consumption really is dominated by series and films nowadays, okay? That's what we're the most exposed to. What is the most likely to, at least to the prism of fiction, influence our perspectives on what people are like and what people's motivations are, and personality types of different characters will influence, if we are interested in that kind of thing, the way that we look at the personality types of people around us, you notice there's a few like very sort of like stock, you know, recurrent thematic kind of personality types for characters in TV shows. And the commonality of these types and subtypes, you know, it's linked to the particular formulas that are just very widely used for developing a particular storyline in a movie or particular plot. You need certain types of characters. So for example, just moving away from Enneagram for a second, you'll notice that the INTJ villain is an absolutely common trope, right? There's a lot of INTJ villains in movies. Far more than there are in reality. So the idea of this like super mastermind, scheming, genius, 250 IQ, INTJ villain, you know, it's very common in fiction, especially in shows and movies. Leads people to think that INTJs are like that in reality, and the reality is they're usually not. Okay, so that's a trope. You'll find it everywhere. But another trope that's very, very common is the hero or the villain being a type 1. And because having a type 1 as a hero or as a villain, obviously, you know, the shows or the movies that make this decision, they don't think in terms of, oh, we should really make that character Enneagram 1. They don't think in terms of Enneagram, or they don't think in terms of MBTI for like INTJs, for instance. However, they will tend to think about, if you like, a package of personality traits that we end up ourselves, because we have the necessary vocabulary for it. We attach that to INTJ or type 1 or other types. Having, for example, an INTP 5 in a piece of fiction like a show or something, it's not easy to make it the main character of a show or the main villain. Often you'll have them as like the nerd kind of computer guy that is helping the hero or helping the villain. But usually the villain is an INTJ or an ENTJ, and the hero is often an INFJ, or, you know, sometimes the hero is an INTJ as well. But the type 1 is very tempting to have for a hero or for a villain, because type 1s, they have this strong sense of being ethically right and having tunnel vision about where the world should be going according to their ethical sense of where it should be going. So you could actually argue this, you know, a very stark definition or very stark depiction of a type 1 is of a type that has an ethical vision that they want to see realized. And they will be they would tend to be unflinching, sometimes even ruthless and unfeeling in terms of wanting to have this vision realized, which is why it's tempting for a lot of people to type, for example, some communists as 1, like Lenin is usually typed as a 1, right? And you will see that with a lot of revolutionaries, that will, in the name of a particular moral vision, be ready to make what you could call sacrifices or what you could call massacres, because they have this obsessive vision of an ethical future. That's wonderful material for fiction, including movies and shows. Of course, that can take the role of a villain, but that can also take you can have that for the hero, you know. So you'll see that there's a lot of INFJ 1s or type 1s, including INFJ 1s, that are heroes, because they also have a vision that happens to be opposed to that of the villain. Like I said, the type 1s don't need to be INFJs in fiction. Sometimes they'll be INTJs. For example, if any of you guys have seen Shogun, like this great show that came out recently on Disney Plus, the main, like the central character, Toranaga, right, the Japanese lord, INTJ 1, very clearly. One of the very main characters, not main, but maybe top 3 central characters, Mariko, beautiful, smart, intelligent woman with a tragic story, INFJ 1. Typical, very typical in fiction, you know, because tragedy, ethical vision, not realized, collateral damage, death, oh, why did I go for this? I shouldn't have gone, I went too far, I was too extreme in the name of my vision. That's all very compatible with dramatic display of an Enneagram 1, and the INFJ is no exception. So you'll have an over-representation of that type in fiction for that very reason. Whereas you won't have an over-representation of type 9 or for type 6. Because it's particularly in the understanding which we have of those types, but type 9 is a fantastic type in many ways, but to display in a way that's very grabbing as part of a piece of fiction, at least according to the formulas that we have nowadays for making catchy, punchy types of shows and movies, very hard to have an INFJ or type 9 main character. Very hard to have a type 6 main character. When do you have a type 6 that's the main character? Happens, but it's a lot more rare than type 1, right? And for this reason, we have an overrepresentation of this type in fiction, particularly among characters that we find in some way impressive. Whereas because they're the hero, or sometimes because they're the villain, because let's not lie to ourselves, oftentimes we are impressed by the craftiness and strategic planning and daring of villains too. So I think there is always going to be an unconscious desire on the part of the viewer to want to identify in some way or other with the central striking characters in the show. And since type 1s are overrepresented, there will be a tendency to overemphasize this desire to resonate with a type. That happens with INFJ 1s because the INFJs, let's face it, the most common INFJs we have in fiction, focusing on TV and TV shows and films, are INFJ 1s. I haven't even tried to obsess over which ones I would present to you, but think of Dumbledore. Think of Gandalf. Think of Gandalf, think of Dumbledore, and like I said, much more recently, think of Mariko from Shogun. They're all INFJs, and they're all INFJ 1s. It's common for an INFJ to have one in their tri-type, for the reasons that we talked about, because of what I once called in the video, and it's an important concept that I want you to hold on to, ethical self-respect. It's true that in the everyday life, in the phenomenology of INFJs, the sense of ethical self-respect is very important. It's usually not so prevalent that it dominates its core, but it's somewhere in the tri-type. It's very common. In fact, I think that if your core is 6 as an INFJ, you're more likely to be a 1. If your core is 5, you're more likely to be a 9 in your tri-type, that is. So if your core is 5, you're more likely to have 9 in your tri-type. If your core is 6, you're more likely to have 1. Why? Because remember what we said in the previous video. The previous video was on the differences between type 6 and type 5, flip sides of the same coin. Type 6 is uncomfortable with alienation and wants to find a way to just bridge that gap, whereas type 5 accepts alienation and tends to find comfort in it and feels no need to bridge that gap. Well, the thing is, type 9 is a type that is also very comfortable within herself or himself, right? This inner harmony is trumps every other priority. So it's compatible with alienation, particularly guided by type 5. So you take, for example, Carl Jung, probably lead 5 was 5'9" something, right? Probably 5'49" or 5'94". 5'94", I think, is the most common type. You take myself, more of a 6, concern, the bridging of the gap between my internal world and external reality is a constant source of concern and sometimes anxiety. The 1 is a reformer by definition. It's usually the type that, the name that is given to it in the mainstream literature. The 1 feels the need to impact the outside world. It doesn't make a lot of sense to live alienated in the form of alienation that is its own logic and it has its own fruitfulness, because again, I always say that alienation is not a bad word in and of itself. So imagine you're self-contained, you're in your world, you're in your universe. Why would you be a core 1? Or why would you even be a 1 fix, have 1 in your tri-type? Because by definition, the 1 wants to change the world according to an ethical vision. Or at least, at the very least, 1 wants to act in the world. If they don't have the ambition to change the world like we see in fiction, they want to act in the world according to this ethical vision. Otherwise, something really rattles in their minds and their souls and their hearts or their guts, to be more Enneagram specific. If there is this constant sense of distance and severance from the external world, then where is the imperative to have this one approach to things? It's much less likely to be common. Whereas in the case of the 6, that's exactly responding with the gut to the concerns of the head type 6. So often 1 comes in the tri-type, not as leads, but in the tri-type of someone whose score is 5, whose score is 6, and when that's, and when that's not the case, well, obviously you can have the other guts, the type 8, even as a fixes would be very rare for INFJs, but for type 6 you'll have often 1 in your tri-type, like in my case. For type 5 you'll often have 9, like Carl Jung, just because there is a compatibility there that we can't ignore. But rarely, again, type 1 will be dominant. I would probably argue that it has the same level of commonality among INFJs that type 2 does. Having thought about it in previous videos, I said it's uncertain whether the 4th place for most common Ennea type is 9 or 1, and I think it's 9 now. It's obvious, because 9 is completely compatible with alienation, whereas 1 is not. 1 is in touch with the external world. It wants to change it, or at least act in it according to certain ethical principles of self-respect and vision. But we're often going to be fooled into thinking that 1 is much more common than that because of pop culture, because of TVs, because of shows, because it just seems to be true that this formula of making a good story with good characters, good drama, good tragedy, good whatever, fits important characters being 1, rather than being types that are more common for INFJs. But let me know what you think in the comments, guys. And at some point, we're going to have to look at type 9, won't we? We will do that at some point. Don't worry. In the meantime, enjoy the rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye.